Thank you, and thank you, Emma. She's always so kind. I can only say it is such a pleasure working with Emma, and it's also a pleasure to see some faces, I know, but not quite as many perhaps as I thought I would, but I can see some, which is great. What I'm going to do today is talk to you about the MCT diet. I'm aware that the title is troubleshooting, problem solving, but I'm going to do a bit of an overview of the MCT diet, talk just very briefly about the biochemistry, one slide only, I promise, just to give us an idea of how this differs from the long-chain fat classical diet, and then talk a little bit about the perceived problems we may have and whether these really are the case with the MCT diet, and then just a little bit about how I might calculate a diet. I would like to say that I'm going to be here to defend the MCT diet. I think it gets a little bit forgotten. I used this example yesterday, so apologies for people who heard this yesterday, but just to give you an example of how this diet can be quite generous. If we have a 1,000 calorie prescription for a small child who weighs 14 kilos, on the classical diet, they get, say, 14 grams protein, they'd end up with 11 grams carbohydrate a day on a 4:1 ratio. If they go on the modified Atkins diet, they'd start off with 10 grams carb and then they'd perhaps go up to 20. We put them on the low glycemic index diet, they might get more, 40 to 60 grams carbohydrate. On an MCT diet, the way we tend to work it out, they get about 48 grams carbohydrate a day. So this is equivalent in carbohydrate generosity as something of the order of the low glycemic index diet. Now we've also got the fact that obviously our trial, and Helen Cross has reported the 3-month results, we're currently finishing looking at the 6 to 12-month results. We haven't seen significant differences in efficacy between the classical and the MCT diet. So I think I feel we mustn't forget the MCT diet. It's really good to be excited about new treatments and new ideas, but let's not forget we also have another diet that many people, including Emma herself, says that when she changed Matthew onto the MCT diet from the classical diet, it was a breath of fresh air in terms of the food choices, and he apparently loved it because it was more relaxed. So I think that's just a little bit of an overview, and I'd like to tell you a little bit more now about what it is. So what is MCT? The T bit is triglyceride, and that means fat, basically. I apologise, there's 2 biochemical slides, but I thought you could do with this sort of background. Fat, triglyceride bit, is made up of fatty acids and glycerol. That's what fat is. It's a string of fatty acids and glycerol. And a medium-chain triglyceride or a medium-chain fat is medium-chain fatty acids. And they contain 8 to 12 carbon atoms. They don't have a double bond, they're what we call saturated. Whereas long-chain are longer than that, and they may have other bonds, they may be what we call unsaturated. I'm sure we've all heard of polyunsaturated fatty acids. And these differences affect the amount of ketones that are produced with the MCT. Now this is my one diagram, so if I can just explain it, it's actually not complicated. Unfortunately, I seem to be unable to use the pointer, everyone else does, but I can't for some reason. The far bit, you've got long-chain fatty acids, LCFA, and medium-chain fatty acids, MCFA, and they are inside the lumen, that's the inside of the intestine. They then pass through the cells, which is the wall of the intestine. The medium chain, if you see the MCFA, whizzes through straight into what we call the portal blood, which is the blood supply that takes them straight to the liver. So they get to the liver very, very quickly. The long chain fat, which is the kind that we have in the classical ketogenic diet, or fat in our foods, the cream, the butter, that actually goes into the cell and forms something called chylomicrons, which is the blue circle, and that actually passes into what we call the lymph system. It then goes around the body, and it gets to something called the left subclavian vein, where it goes into the blood, carried around the tissues, gets to the liver. So we've got a difference in absorption. The MCT fat is absorbed much quicker. It's actually also inside the intestine, it's also digested quicker by the enzymes. So that's sort of overview of this. And then the third difference is when fat gets to the liver, these fatty acids get to the liver, they need to get into something called the mitochondria to actually form energy. And they need carnitine. The carnitine shuttle, we've just been hearing from Carol about carnitine. But this shuttle, which gets the fatty acids inside the liver mitochondria to form energy, needs carnitine if they are long-chain fats, but not if they're medium-chain fat. So medium-chain fatty acids don't need carnitine to get into the mitochondria. And once they're in the mitochondria, both types of fat is used to make something called acetyl-CoA, which is used to form energy, or it can form ketone bodies. So that is the end to my biochemistry lecture. But I think what I wanted to tell you, wanted to explain is what is MCT, why is it different? Well, these differences in the way it works in the body mean that it actually does make more ketones per gram than long-chain fat. So if we actually come back to the diet, this was first written up in 1971 by Huttenlocher, suggested that if you use this type of fat in a diet, you could get away with a more generous diet in terms of carbohydrate and protein because it made more ketones, and he showed that in 1976 a diet using 60% of energy as MCT was as effective as a 3-to-1 classical diet in 12 children. And the MCT bit traditionally was oil, but as most of you know who've been on the diet, what's more commonly used now is something called lipogen. And then the remaining 40% of energy is about, and usually use about 10% of that as protein, 19% of carbohydrate, and the remaining 11% is fat in food. And as I've already given you the example with our 14-year-old child, that is very generous in carbohydrate. What is a modified MCT diet? It's something you've probably heard of. That's a diet that was first devised, written up by Ruby Schwartz and her colleagues in Oxford in the 1980s, because they found, indeed, there had been a lot of reports of gastrointestinal problems, nausea, bloating, diarrhea, vomiting. When you put children on this 60% MCT diet, this traditional MCT diet that I've just mentioned. So they suggested you cut the MCT fat to half, you use 30% of energy as MCT, you put in the extra bit as ordinary fat, and the remaining is the same as the previous diet. Indeed, at the same time, there was a diet from Great Ormond Street, which is nothing to do with our trial, it very much predates that, that was very similar, but used 100-calorie exchanges for food. So that's a bit of a background to the MCT diet. Now, do we have problems? Are there problems with the MCT diet? Why, at times, is it perceived as less popular? Is this a real problem? I've just written down 5 of the most common criticisms that I hear about the diet, and then I thought I'd just go through and just sort of go through each one. Incorporation of the MCT into the diet. I'll talk a little bit more later on in the presentation about how we might do that. But yes, this can be a problem. And certainly, historically, many children were just given doses of lipogen or oil to drink with their meal, a bit like a medicine. Well, you try getting a 4-year-old to drink 40 mils of lipogen. No way. So I think that's partly historically why it's got such a bad name. We could be more adventurous with the way we incorporate the MCT into the meals, and as I say, I'll mention that later. We usually use an exchange system. And also historically, and even nowadays, this can be very unstructured. We can give, at times, we as dietitians could just give families lists. This is carbohydrate, this is protein, this is your daily amount of lipogen, just go away, get on with it. And I think my view is we need to be a little bit more structured in the way we balance out the carbohydrate and the fat, i.e. particularly the MCT fat, at each meal. So I think that is another problem. Do we give too many calories? Well, I went into more detail about this yesterday, and I won't go into too much detail today, but traditionally we have been perhaps more generous in calories. We don't have that view with our study. When we did the trial comparing the two, we started off at exactly the same premise with calories for both diets, and I'll mention that in a later slide. Do they make good ketones with this diet? Now, this has been another criticism. I haven't got the slide today, but yesterday I showed a slide that showed that our early results suggested that actually children were, as a group, less ketotic on the MCT diet, as a group. That's not as individuals. Some of the most ketotic children we saw, in terms of their blood ketones, were actually on the MCT diet. But if you looked at group levels, mean average levels, they were lower. But does this matter? We don't see any difference in seizure control, so I don't know. It doesn't. But because they do have this increased amount of carbohydrate. And then the fifth criticism, which is probably the most commonly given one, is it causes all these problems with abdominal problems. I just want to briefly show you some of our results, which I know Helen has. I don't want to go over all of these, but this is a group of children that, well, the children who started the classical and the MCT diet, 61 and 64. And the numbers we withdrew before 3 months. And on here it does look like 3 with the diarrhoea on the MCT group, 1 with vomiting, did actually withdraw. So slightly more, though we didn't have any classical diet withdrawals due to these problems. I won't go through the rest of the slide because we are short on time. If we look at reported side effects at 3 months, that's a questionnaire. Those of you who did the trial will know our famous, slightly tedious questionnaires we gave you to do every single visit. Well, it was worth it because we have analysed them. We have got these results. So thank you for doing those. And these are some results of the classical diet and the MCT diet at 3 months. And we can see here really there's hardly any differences. Certainly in diarrhoea, we've got 15% on the classical diet, 14% on the MCT diet. Very similar numbers in vomiting. Just over a quarter on both diets did report that at some point their child had vomiting. Not enough so we're not talking about major problems causing dietary withdrawal or dehydration. We're just talking about some reports of vomiting. Constipation was higher on the classical diet, but this wasn't significant. We talk about we had significance, but it wasn't statistically significant, which is important in terms of defining a difference. And slightly more reports of abdominal pain on the MCT group, but again, nothing significant. And if you look at our 12-month results, then you'll see that actually on the classical diet, 45% reported vomiting, as opposed to 13% on the MCT diet, and that was significant. So there were more reports on the classical diet of vomiting, slightly more diarrhoea on the MCT diet and abdominal pain. Constipation very high on both groups. And as I said yesterday, I think this is one of the interesting things. We assumed that the MCT group would not be as constipated, but they were. At any time in our trial, 40% of our children needed medication for constipation. So I think this is something as a dietitian I need to work harder at. We all need to, because we do have a major problem whichever diet the children are on. I just want to interject, I'm sorry your handouts are slightly confused. You do have these results, but I put they're at the end of the handouts. I just jiggled the slides quickly beforehand to make it a bit quicker, so you do have this in your handouts. So how do we calculate the diet as a dietitian? Well, the first thing is we need to look at how many calories a child needs. And this is what I said earlier, that traditionally the UK recommendations have used something called the reference nutrient intake, which is actually more generous than we would be with a classical diet. My belief is we should actually go with the same principles of both diets, and as I said, we did that in our trial. And the important thing is to look at the child as an individual. What's happening to their weight, what was their previous weight, height, their body mass index, that's the BMI, what's happening with their activity, their seizure levels, and also we always ask children to do a diet history. So I think we can scratch out that suggestion that we are more generous in calories with the MCT diet. I think we should actually adopt the same premise for both diets. Then the next step is we need to look at how much MCT is in the diet. Now those of you who are doing the MCT diet are probably familiar with this. The others, I apologise, you're not, but I mentioned earlier that the original MCT diets were really trying to get to 60% of your calories from MCT. The modified ones were looking at 30%. Now, when I first started the trial, I used 30% because I was frightened of all these gastrointestinal symptoms that I'd read about. I thought I was just going to get so many children reporting this. So let's go for 30%. I found I had to push it up, actually, to get good ketosis and better seizure control. So my view is, rather than saying there's 2 types of MCT diet, let's just call them all the MCT diet, and let's fine-tune the amount of MCT. And we ended up really with our trial usually starting children off at somewhere between 40 to 50% of their energy as MCT. And that seems to work well. It doesn't seem to be a problem. And then some children, particularly the older ones, needed more, and they did go up to 60% of their energy. And others, the younger ones, stayed on that level. Very few we had to go down below that because of problems. And I have mentioned there is some discrepancy of the MCT content of the fat. Don't worry too much about this, but those of you who actually read the labels on your liquid or MCT oil, if you are confused, I'm happy to explain this in more detail afterwards. But it is a bit confusing. There's different labelling laws that mean that fat is labelled in different ways either side of the Atlantic. And as I said before, liquogen is 2 times the volume of MCT oil because liquogen is what we call an emulsion, which means the fat is mixed with water. So if you use 10 mils of MCT oil in a meal, you'd use 20 of liquogen. So the third step is looking at the daily prescription. I've mentioned the liquogen. Well, the MCT. Protein is usually about 10% of energy. Carbohydrate, 15 to 19% of energy. I've already given you that example of a child who was about 14 kilos. That's not, that might be 3, who's got 48 grams of carbohydrate. This is generous, this diet. And the remaining is long-chain fat. And then obviously as a dietitian, we have to turn this into something that's practical for you guys to use, for your family, your children. And traditionally we've used exchanges. Many people say to me, can we use EKM? That's the ketogenic calculator I developed with Bruce Carroll. We'll hear more about this afternoon. Can we use that on the MCT diet? And the answer is yes, but you need to use it if you're calculating meal recipes. You would need to get your dietitian to give you the values for each meal, so you can then calculate recipes. If you're using an exchange system, so instead of that you're saying pick 1 carbohydrate, 1 fat, 1 protein for each meal, then you can't use EKM because you've actually got beyond that anyway in simplicity. So, but you could do it either way. Some people you like milk, some people don't. Some children love milk, liquid milk mixed with their milk. Others don't. If you're on an MCT diet and your dietitian has given you a milk allowance, because this is it, that's what it says in the textbooks that you do, and that's the way you're told to get your liquid in. And if your child just won't drink it, tell the dietitian to take the milk out, because there's lots of other ways to get the liquid in, and the last thing you want is to be forcing a milk liquid mix into a child that can't bear it. And how you give vegetables again varies. Some centres do free veg. I tend to use a vegetable exchange list. I'm stricter. Because we were doing a trial, we had to have the same strictness on both diets. And exchanges are often 10 gram carbohydrates, 6 protein, 5 fat. Now, I haven't got a clue when I started Emma, so you'll have to help me. Am I all right? You give me a wave, and I'm getting near the end of my time. Right. Don't worry too much. You can't see this, but this is just to show you we do have exchange lists. This is 10 gram carbohydrate exchanges, and it divides them into different subgroups. We've got 6 gram protein exchanges. So the way these work is we would say, a dietitian might say, choose 2 protein at this meal. So you can choose them both as cheese or both as fish. So it's using that type of system, and this is fat adjusted, which means you add extra fat for the low protein. The protein exchanges that are very low in fat, like white fish or white meat, you add extra fat to balance it up for something like cheese. And then fat exchanges, that's a fat exchange list that we've used in our trial. And then vegetable exchange lists I use, which are very similar to those in the John Hopkins book, Group A and Group B. We just call it 1, 2 and 3, and they're the same as we use for the classical diet. So how do we get the MCT oil or the liquid in? I said that might be a problem. I've said that many children don't like it in milk, so how do we get it in? Well, I think recipes are the answer. I've put milk drinks, many children do like it in milk. They will have a sort of MCT, milk drink before they go to bed, and that's great, but others don't. I'll come back to recipes. Sugar-free jelly can be great. Those of you who've worked with me know I always go on about sugar-free jelly. It looks like milk jelly. It tastes fine. I've actually fed it to my own husband, and it is actually quite palatable, I can assure you. Perhaps not every day or every meal, but it is. And Matthew's Friends website is great for recipe ideas. I've learned so much from Emma. When I started this, I was telling people to use milk drinks and sugar-free jelly, because I'm not a great cook in terms of going into my kitchen and fiddling around with things. And Matthew has, Emma, with Tony as well, has come up with lots of different ideas, which I believe are still all on the website. Just a few things like you can make chocolate brownies with liquogen. You can make a sort of yogurt with low fat, low carbohydrate, like a Muller Light yogurt. We can use a type of ice cream, could be made up with liquogen, milk, a bit of fruit. We can make pancakes, or Emma can make pancakes. Sort of dip, mixing liquogen, cream cheese and cheddar cheese, and things like sort of fruit or vegetable sticks to go in, or some little mini breadsticks and mini cheddars. They can have mini breadsticks and mini cheddars on the MCT diet because it is so much more relaxed. Egg custard, cooking it, making it to be like a sort of quiche consistency. Another idea is throwing liquogen or MCT oil into lasagna, casserole, shepherd's pies, pasta sauces, curry sauces, soups, adding it to eggs. So we've got a lot more flexibility. The key is keeping it palatable in terms of keeping very good ways to get the liquogen or the MCT oil into the diet. As with the classical diet, those of you who work with me will know that I always do an emergency milkshake, which is a meal replacer, and this works just as well with an MCT diet as it does with the classical diet. You can use, you can add a little bit of fruit or a bit of yogurt usually to keep the carbohydrate up, so it's the same as the meal. I always say with the emergency milkshakes, they're very limited and they've got no vitamins and minerals or trace elements in, and they're just for a meal replacer. They're not for 4 days down the nasogastric tube or something like that. And then the last step in calculating a diet is just as with the classical diet, we need to bear in mind we need supplementation. We've heard that with every one of the diets we've heard talked about. We tend to use Forceval Junior in the UK. You may need calcium, you may not on the MCT diet. It depends how much dairy products are in. That should always be worked out. And do we need essential fatty acids? MCT, as I mentioned initially, is what we call a saturated fat. You've got a lot of it in your diet. You don't have any of these long-chain polyunsaturated fatty acids. It's probably worth working hard with the remaining bit of fat you've got to include some of the vegetable oils or walnut oil, something like that, rather than just cream or butter. And sometimes it's sometimes an idea to supplement with a tiny little bit, or make sure you do always include something like 2 mils of the long-chain oil a day. But there's been no literature evidence on whether this is a problem. It's very theoretical. And then last 2 slides, ongoing modifications. Just as with the classical diet, the MCT diet needs to be fine-tuned. If anyone gives you an MCT diet, says go away, we'll review it in 3 months, but we won't change it, and then 3 months' time later, it's still not changed, and the child's only making trace ketones, seizure control's okay, but not better. It's got to be fine-tuned. It's a ketogenic diet. It should be fine-tuned exactly as a classical diet would. So what would we do? Well, we could certainly look at the weight and the energy prescription. We could decrease the MCT if there were problems with tolerance. We could go up on the MCT if we didn't feel the seizure control was good enough and we wanted to try and push the ketones to see if that helped. We could go down on the carbohydrate. We've got lots of carbohydrate to play with. We could go down a little bit. We could look at protein if there's problems with growth or albumin level. And we obviously adjusting the daily plan. If the child changes school, they need a snack suddenly in the middle of the morning. We look at the whole plan and we change it. And we look at vitamins and minerals. And then can we tube feed an MCT diet child? We can. You know, we can. If the child is going to be starting a diet from scratch, starting a tube feed diet from scratch, to be honest, they're better using one of the products like Ketocal, the only product, which is Ketocal, which is a classical diet feed. But you can make up a modular feed if you have a child who was already on an MCT diet and they suddenly needed tube feeding, say during a hospital admission for a few days. You could do a modular feed, which means as a dietitian you calculate whatever loads, probably about 8 different things to go into it to make it a balance for a meal. And the product Ketoplex is no longer available, which is a shame. And this is really just for dietitians, but we have to include essential fatty acids if we're doing a modular feed, and vitamins and minerals. So that's a bit of a summary really on the MCT diet, and I think if anyone has questions we will do that at the end of the next session.